The following program has been rated TV 14. It contains the use of a derogatory racial term. Viewer discretion is advised.
Attucks, the school that opened a city, was made possible through the generous support of the Ephraimson Family Fund, Lilly Endowment, C&O Financial Group providing health and life insurance as well as retirement solutions, the Indianapolis Foundation, an affiliate of the Central Indiana Community Foundation, the Allen Whitehill Clues Charitable Foundation, Impact 100 Greater Indianapolis, the family of Samuel and Alexis Odell, Thomas Sharp, Donald Moffett. Additional funding was provided by the following.
Those things that I learned in Attucks were ingrained in me, and I commanded thousands of soldiers, and I was able to give them the feeling that they were somebody. You know, I am somebody.
He was my immediate boss, and we got to know each other extremely well, and Harry was the guy that taught us how to be generals.
So for those airmen, the act of flying itself was a symbol of liberation for themselves and for all African Americans. One of those first pilots, a man named Charles DeBow, put it this way. He said that a takeoff was, in his words, a never-failing miracle, where all the bumps would smooth off. You're in the air, out of this world, free.
And one night from my desk, I called Congressional Research Service and I said, could you tell me whether or not Mrs. Rosa Parks got the Congressional Gold Medal? And they said, not yet. I said, well, just hold on just a little while longer.
People were proud of Crispus Attucks, proud. It's a part of who I am now. It's not an acquisition. It's me.
We knew nothing else. There was nothing else but Attucks.
Without Crispus Attucks, I don't know. It was my all in all.
It just lifted me up. Just lifted me up.
Every day you walked in there, you could hear whispers of the past saying, you can do it. You can do it.
Everything that I will ever achieve in life came because I attended Crispus Attucks High School.
If it hadn't been for Attucks, I never would have made it. That is the truth.
This school means so much to the city, to the state, to the nation, because it shows what can be done.
Absolutely, Attucks is a national story. It was created out of hatred, but it has endured, and its legacy is an amazing one.
You walk those halls. You walk in those steps of giants. The irony that it was the Klan who didn't want us to have something and enabled a powerful school with students and teachers who excelled.
But it wasn't the Klan who created Crispus Attucks High School. Racism in Indiana ran far deeper than that. In Indiana's first century, most white Hoosiers didn't set out to treat African Americans as second-class citizens. They didn't want African Americans to be citizens at all.
It is a democracy created in 1816 for white males only.
The state's first constitution in 1816 and laws passed in the next few years ensured that African Americans were not allowed, among other things, to vote, join the militia, testify in court against white people, or marry them, the last of which stayed on the books nearly 150 years. An 1831 bill required blacks to post a bond of $500 upon moving to the state, the equivalent of more than $10,000 today, to guarantee they wouldn't become beggars or criminals. The state's second constitution, in 1851, made things even plainer. Legislators took the unusual step of allowing the public to vote on that article, and the public didn't let them down. 5-1 statewide in favor of the ban. In Marion County, it was 8-1.
It went even further because it required African Americans already in Indiana in 1851 to go down to their courthouse in their county and take a witness and register. Negro registries, they were called.
4 years later, the governor advocated sending Indiana's blacks back to Africa.
Colonization was seen as an enlightened view. You know, it's like, we're not trying to kill you, and we're not trying to enslave you. We're just trying to send you back. Your purpose has been served. You know, you were here to help us build this country. We think we can take it from here.
And if the Constitution, the public, and the governor left anything to question, it was answered on signposts outside the so-called sunset towns that laced the Hoosier countryside.
That is, you better be out of this town before the sun sets or you're in trouble.
Even after banning blacks from entering the state was no longer feasible, and they would finally have to be allowed into public schools, Indiana gave itself an out. When desired, school systems could build separate facilities for blacks, and they often did. In practice, this primarily meant grade schools, because the only jobs African Americans could get were in labor and didn't require anything more.
They didn't see any future in getting a high school education. What was it going to do? You just go out and get the same job you'd have gotten if you finished the 6th grade.
But a breakthrough came in 1872 when Superintendent A.C. Shortridge integrated Indianapolis High School, which would later bear his name. Against the will of the faculty, Shortridge escorted Mary Ann Rann into the school. She graduated 4 years later, starting a trickle of black students in Indianapolis seeking secondary education. And then the African-American northern migration began, and fear set in. Newspapers and the city's foremost historian fretted over Negro no accounts and objectionable Negroes terrorizing the community. As early as 1908, with about 80 blacks in the city's 2 high schools, the superintendent warned his board that the time was coming to remove the colored children. And then World War I brought even more African Americans to the city seeking war-related work, along with a regrettable new coded phrase that made for a combustible confluence.
100% Americans. World War I gave us that strange notion that there is such a thing as a 100% American, and that those were the good Americans, the better Americans, rather than those who were immigrants from foreign lands, rather than those who were a color other than white, 100% Americans were the choice Americans, the ones who really needed to be there if the nation was going to prosper and survive in this time of great, great difficulty, not just during the war, but after the war.
By 1920, 35,000 African Americans lived in Indianapolis, more than double the number of 20 years earlier. That constituted more than 11% of the population, the highest black percentage among major northern cities. The 80 black high school students in 1910 became 800 in 1920. For many white parents, that was 800 too much. It was all too much. Fear became firestorm.
They were encroaching on neighborhoods. There was this fear that there are too many Negroes coming into Indianapolis. They're invading Indianapolis, and the only way that we're going to get a handle on it is to create segregation.
Civic groups sprung up. Mrs. Daisy Dean Deeds and her White Supremacy League, calling out for red-blooded, all-white gentlemen to join the cause. The White People's Protective League, the Capitol Avenue Protective Association, the Mapleton Civic Association. None of these was considered extremist. Their members were among the most respected citizens in the city. Their goal was unmuddied: to keep blacks in their place, out of white neighborhoods where they were met with 8-foot-high fences, rocks, even hand grenades, and out of white schools.
I don't think the term equal rights even existed at the time. And it's hard to believe, looking back, that it was that severe, but it really was.
It really all goes back to bullying. You know, people say, we're going to do this and we're not going to allow you in. And we have the power, we have the might, we have the ability to keep you out, and this is how we're going to do it.
In education, 1922 marked the boiling point. The civic groups latched onto a medical argument, claiming a separate high school was necessitated by the disproportionate level of tuberculosis among blacks. Though that was hardly surprising given the overcrowding in their penned-in neighborhoods and the fact that only one wing of one hospital would treat them.
It's administrivia code, bureaucratic speak, to take a very difficult and unpleasant ideological reality and turn it into something that seems palatable. This is what city governments do everywhere. This is what realtors do. That's why racism becomes acceptable. We have these ways of codifying it.
The Chamber of Commerce joined the segregation push, as did parent-teacher organizations and the principal of Shortridge, the school whose namesake had integrated high schools a half-century earlier. The Indianapolis Times, which a few years later would win a Pulitzer Prize for its anti-Klan crusade, called integrated schooling indefensible. It all begged the question of not which whites supported the creation of a black high school, but if any did not.
No. The answer is no. I've thought about that. I'll have to say no. I just couldn't come up with anything.
There was no champion. There was no person that stands out and says, what we're doing is wrong. No. In fact, what we have is people who seem to be, based on their other actions, open-minded, egalitarian type people who voted in favor of segregated schools or restrictions.
I'm not surprised, though. I'm not surprised. Even if a white person had it in their heart to say this is really wrong, would they be willing to speak out, though? I think they'd be ostracized.
A few in the black community were in favor of a segregated high school because it meant more black teaching jobs. But the heavy majority objected, castigating it as unjust, un-American, and against the spirit of democratic ideals.
This idea of segregating people was really offensive to African Americans. There were integrated high schools in many other cities, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Cleveland, and those schools weren't being segregated.
Black people knew there was no such thing as separate but equal because they knew somehow they were going to get the shaft.
The protest went unmentioned and unanswered when the school board spun out its unanimous decision. Praising the laudable desire of blacks to want to attend high school, the city would build them one of their very own.
These were children. These were young people. They were not wishing them well. They were just trying to get them out of their white school, see. And this was the Board of School Commissioners, who is supposed to look out for every child under their watch.
And then the Ku Klux Klan crashed Indiana in full, and things got even worse.
The Klan in Indiana was a comet. It just seemed to come out of nowhere, and it grew like wildfire. Thousands and tens of thousands of people rushed to join this organization.
On Independence Day, 1923, David Curtis Stevenson's plane touched down at a massive rally in Kokomo, reportedly the largest Klan meeting ever. And a growing Indiana movement took off. Transplanted Oklahoman, charismatic salesman, bully, womanizer, and charlatan, Stevenson set up shop in the Kresge building in downtown Indianapolis, took up residence at a former Butler sorority remodeled to resemble the Klan's national headquarters in Atlanta, and built a Klan empire unsurpassed in the history of the North. At its peak, in the mid-1920s, there were 300,000 to 400,000 dues-paying Klansmen and women in the state, between a quarter and a third of the white population. A 1924 rally brought tens of thousands of them to the state fairgrounds and downtown for a muscle-flexing parade.
I stood on Meridian Street for over 2 hours, watching Klansmen as they passed along that street in their white robes. Over 2 hours. I got tired, went out, and then I left, and they were still passing.
By 1925, the Indiana governor, the Indianapolis mayor, the majority of the state legislature, and all 5 members of the newly elected Indianapolis School Board were either Klansmen or Klan-backed.
The hate in their heart.
Faustina Cotman Pryor, now 95, distinctly remembers as a little girl her mother returning home ashen-faced after a near run-in with hooded marchers on College Avenue.
Oh, yes, she was frightened to death. She was scared to death because, I mean, the Klan hated black people, and so she didn't know what they would have done to her. It makes me feel that they were just ignorant to the fact that we were human and just as important as they were.
Indeed, while the Klan of the 1920s more openly denounced Catholic Jews and immigrants, it also stayed true to its anti-black roots. And while the Klan's reign in Indiana lasted but a few years, and legislatively it accomplished next to nothing, its stomach-turning collapse created a stain that no amount of time can scrub clean.
I think the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan in particular, was the worst that happened in Indiana's history.
When D.C. Stevenson kidnapped, raped, tortured, and partially cannibalized a 28-year-old Indianapolis woman, it triggered the end of the Klan's reign and was covered coast to coast. And when, in an effort to extort his release, he desperately started revealing names of hundreds of government officials in the Klan's sway, Indiana became a national embarrassment.
Indiana in national circles had a good reputation, in fact, a kind of unique and impressive reputation. And then along comes the Klan. And Indiana stinks if you're standing outside and looking into Indiana. If you're standing in New York or California or Chicago, it stinks.
Amid the uproar, cut off in virtually every way from the national hubris of the Roaring Twenties, African Americans in Indianapolis huddled ever closer. 3 main pockets had developed, the most concentrated on the near west side, close to the city's first settlement a century earlier. It was known as the Bottoms, a low-lying, bug-infested hodgepodge of tar paper shacks, outhouses, and pre-industrial poverty surrounded by Fall Creek, the White River, and the foul Central Canal. The area that is now the IUPUI campus.
We would have found thousands of houses there in 1950, actually, 1960 for that matter. And obviously, having thousands and thousands of outhouses drawing, going into the same aquifer, very close to the water table now by the river with those pump wells.
We didn't have running, no furnace, nothing like that. We went outside to the privy house. Some of them called privy. They had all kind of nicknames.
The difficult conditions in those neighborhoods were truly unpleasant.
This was just part of life, I thought then.
The Klan's demise had affected the desire for a segregated high school not a bit, and it was here that it would go. Objections that the site was 3 blocks from a dump and a noxious glue factory went unheeded. A lawsuit to prevent the school from being built failed, was appealed, and failed again. A lone victory came with the school's name. African Americans railed against initial plans to call it Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder, and instead chose Crispus Attucks, an escaped slave and the first American to die in the Revolutionary War. 5 years after the school was commissioned, it came time. As the Stevenson-sparked scandal reached a fever pitch, as whites continued to guard their neighborhoods and the black population continued to increase, over in the bottoms of Indianapolis, a principal was chosen, a faculty assembled, an opening date set. And across town in Irvington, a few blocks from Stevenson's house, a decision was made. Butler University, the city's only major college and one that was founded by an abolitionist, would begin limiting its annual enrollment of African American students to 10, starting the very month that Attucks would open its doors, September of 1927. Into this environment, Crispus Attucks High School was born.
Northern school systems are not segregating their schools in the 1920s. There are some that still had segregated schools from the past, but they're not creating segregated schools. Indianapolis creates a segregated school system in 1927. 1927. I think Indianapolis, Crispus Attucks, was the most unique African-American relegated school in the United States. What model might they have used to create Crispus Attucks? There's no model. Nobody had done that.
You must remember, this is one thing that the Negroes must get in their head. So many of them don't seem to understand this. We didn't come here, we were brought here. We weren't brought here to be put in college. We weren't brought here to become lawyers and doctors and college graduates. We were brought here to labor. And that's what they want us to do to this day. And in order to carry out that kind of system, we have to have the people segregated, separated, classified, categorized. And they want to keep us in that position.
People realizing that education was important, and Attucks being the only game in town at that point, they understood what was at stake, and that every part of that school had to succeed in order for the race within the confines of Indianapolis to succeed. They knew how important it was. Everybody knew how important it was.
From the beginning, it was the teachers who stood Attucks proud and tall. The very first one set the tone. Son of a slave, John Morton Finney was a Buffalo soldier, serving in the Philippines and then in France during World War I. He would amass 12 advanced degrees, learn 7 languages, and serve as an attorney until age 106, before passing away at 108. He oversaw the language department at Attucks, where he taught for more than 30 years.
He was a small man in stature, very small, but he had this very strong historic presence. It's almost like he carried the whole history of black people in his little body to and from the classroom, and he walked down the hall and everybody knew Mr. Morton Finney was passing by. God was passing by.
And having just met him, and he told me that I was the second president that he's met. The first was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But having met him, I know this is a risk to praise him, but I have to disagree with him. I hope you'll join me in commending a man who may be America's most seasoned scholar, John Morton Finney. Would you stand up, please, Mr. Morton Finney?
Likewise, Morton Finney's early colleagues comprised a who's who of African American achievement. Mers Tate, the first black woman to earn a degree at Oxford and a PhD in international relations at Harvard. Fred Parker, who graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Amherst and later taught at Yale. Clarence Harvey Mills, who earned a bachelor's at Dartmouth and a PhD at the University of Chicago. Dr. Joseph Carroll, Francis Stout, Letty Wycliffe, George White. The list went on. Many came from the South, where Jim Crow laws prevented them from being professors at state universities and where the historically black colleges paid next to nothing. In Indianapolis, many moved into the only place they could afford, the YMCA.
I think they knew that they were involved in something special, and they could make something special out of this circumstance that they were in. And I think they knew that, and I think that incentivized them to be harder, to ask for more, and say, we're going to get these kids out, they're going to be something.
The man who found and led them, Matthias Nolcox, couldn't have come from a more fitting place.
A prosperous, thriving black settlement in 19th century Indiana in Lyles Station.
A small patch of farmland in the southwestern part of the state, Lyles Station had been a haven for African Americans since before the Civil War.
They're freed slaves. Later on, there's some fugitive slaves who's come there. They build an African Methodist Episcopal church. They build a school. They believe in education. But the Nolcoxes were very important in Lyles Station from almost the beginning.
You know, kind of tough people. And I say that respectfully, tough. They put up with a lot. And I think that's where Dad learned and experienced in his own raising up how you have to stand on your own.
It had everything to do with who he was.
Born and raised in a house suspended on stilts on a spit of wetland near the Patoka River, Nolcox intended to follow the family tradition of farming, but a childhood accident left his hand crippled. So he threw his concentration into his studies. He worked his way through college, living in basements and feeding coal fires for room and board, and earned a bachelor's from Indiana and a master's from Harvard. He was a 39-year-old principal at an all-black middle school in Indianapolis, School 26, when he got the call.
To have stood tall, or to have stood at all, he would have had to have been a pretty strong person. You know, he was a relatively young man. And the task before him was very, very difficult.
Crispus Attucks High School opened on September 12, 1927, and challenges poured in with the students. The school had been built for 1,000, about 200 more than the total black enrollment in the city's other high schools. 1,350 showed up. Among them was a 15-year-old sophomore named Doris Rutledge.
I was excited.
Scared?
Yes. Sorta.
There were probably 300 or 400 students who came who were not expected, but who just came out of the woodwork.
Others had no intention of coming. Maxine Stanley's father, who was enrolled at Manual, was among 24 black students who went to their old high schools only to learn they were no longer welcome.
He said, but this is my school. They said, not anymore. And said, we will use physical force if you don't turn around and leave. They said the nigger and all that, you know, go to the black school, go with the rest of the coons, all of that stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
At Attucks, students found a first-rate building and second- or third-hand materials. Science equipment, band instruments, athletic uniforms, all were hand-me-downs, if that.
We weren't given anything. We weren't given athletic equipment. We'd have to go around and beg. Maybe you can go to Butler or some of these colleges and get their cast taught. You were actually ashamed when a team appeared on the field.
Nolcox sat down for none of it.
And the first morning of the school, I asked the school board to come out there. I wanted them to hear what I had to say. That anything less than the best that Indiana can afford wasn't good enough for Attucks High School. And I said, we don't have a college high school here. We have a high school.
When the chairs, the beautiful new auditorium chairs, were ordered for the new Attucks High School, they took them to Shortridge and pulled the old ones out of Shortridge to take to Attucks. And my dad physically stood across the door with his arms stretched out, said, don't bring those in here. take them back and bring us our new ones.
He not only wanted Attucks to succeed, he wanted Attucks to be superior. And that's where he ran into a great deal of trouble with the school board.
With the white public, too. Death threats were routine at the Nolcox house. Friends stood guard overnight with shotguns. His young children were guarded going to school.
Well, I know that one time they broke into our house at night in there on Highland Place, and Dad stood at the head of the stairs with his gun, and we all stood, Mama had us kids standing back in the bedroom holding on to us, and Dad yelled down, "If you travel these stairs, I'll shoot," and whoever it was took off.
With the Attucks students and teachers, Nolcox ran the strictest of ships. The first school motto came right from the top: labor conquers all. No silliness, no dances, no pep rallies. This would be a college prep school, all about work.
But you see, my dad had values and the like, and he couldn't, maybe I shouldn't say this in an interview, but my dad was not very sympathetic with people who believed other than he believed. And so he needed control. And I think that was the reason that he finally had to leave Attucks.
Historians of the school believe it took such an unbending hand to keep Attucks afloat amid the challenges and slights of the time. Prime example, Nolcox had to watch his very first graduates receive their diplomas from the president of the so-called Klan School Board.
In my mind, the success of the Crispus Attucks students, especially the first couple of classes, was an act of resistance by the African American community. It was an act of resistance. It was an act of, we will defy your expectations.
Yet Nolcox's defiance likely cost him his job. After just 3 years at Attucks, Nolcox had gained the enmity of both the school board and some teachers and parents, the latter for being too demanding. He would work for 20 more years in Indianapolis public schools, most as principal at grade school number 4. But according to his children, he left his heart at Attucks.
It knocked a big hole in his spirit, and it stayed with him the rest of his life.
Nolcox was replaced by a teacher he hired. Russell Lane had a bachelor's degree from Brown, a doctorate from IU, and a penchant for punctuality that became his defining characteristic.
2 minutes to go, 2 minutes to go, clear the hall, and the halls would get cleared.
I never went in the front door that he wasn't out there. 2 minutes, 2 minutes, 2 minutes.
On Lane's first day as principal, one of those he exhorted was Elman Myers, who at 102 is now one of Attucks' oldest living graduates.
He was standing on about the third step. He was going the front door. And he kind of walked to me and welcomed me. He welcomed me good. And I felt good going in there.
Myers came from a family of 17 children, 7 of whom died in infancy. They lived in poverty on Indianapolis's east side.
Tight ain't the word. We had a dirt street, old house, somebody done moved out of it, it wasn't worth a dime, but we made it.
Another early Attucks student, Alberta Stanley White, now 98, had moved to Indianapolis from Georgia when she was 5.
My sister used to tell me the story that when we got off the train, I said, "Oh, look, they got cotton on the ground." And it was the first snow I had ever seen.
Like Elman Myers, Alberta walked 3 miles to school because the city wouldn't pay for transportation. As with Elman and so many others, what she found there made it worthwhile.
I wanted something that would want me. And so when they built us a new school just for us, I thought it was a blessing.
Made me feel good, made me feel welcome, made me feel free.
It taught us our background, where we came from, what we had endured. Like the old song said, "I'm black and proud."
Outside Attucks, an insular, joyful pride took hold as well. The Depression raged, hitting the black community particularly hard, and even with the Klan gone, racism ran unabated. A visiting national NAACP official said violations of basic rights of African Americans were more flagrant and vicious in Indianapolis than in any other northern or western city. Yet a community bonded and grew from within. Attucks' first year also saw the opening of the Walker Theater, a bustle of entertainment and commerce that injected new life into the community's heart, Indiana Avenue. And that heart began beating with a rhythm all its own.
Where you could hear the music, you could see the people dressed up and down the avenue, sharp as a tack, proud, strutting high.
The Cotton Club and Sunset Terrace, Henri's, George's, a dozen more. The Avenue became part of the Chitlin Circuit, with top blues and jazz stars like Count Basie and Duke Ellington joining local stalwarts Freddie Hubbard, Wes Montgomery, and the Hampton family, and Attucks grads such as Errol Grandy and J.J. Johnson. And soon, a young trombonist named David Baker.
Indiana Avenue was where I learned to play. The place has been permeated with that idea that, hey, let's kick ass.
Near the base of the avenue, the Senate Avenue YMCA became the largest African-American Y in the country, with so-called monster meetings bringing in the greatest speakers of the era. At the top of the strip rose Lockfield Gardens, a federal housing project that became the national model. Where once had stood some of the worst slums in the city were now 24 brick buildings holding 748 apartments with heat, water, and a joie de vivre still felt today.
It was just a wonderland. We had the playground out there. They had these magnificent swing sets and monkey poles that we used to play on it. And we were just kids in short pants and scrubby knees and whatnot. But the heartbeat, I can imagine it right now.
Nowhere was the community pride fiercer than at Attucks. Nowhere else brought all walks of life together. If you were a black teenager in Indianapolis, from the west side, east side, south side, or near north, if your parents were doctors, servants, or unemployed, Attucks was home away from home.
It gave you the feeling that you were somebody, regardless of the segregation. You went to Crispus Attucks High School, you were somebody,
And the new home opened new worlds.
The lives, in a lot of our cases, by being very poor, they didn't have a lot of substance because the family didn't have an awful lot to offer besides mere survival. It was a way to have a life.
Word of Attucks' success spread. Some of the biggest black celebrities in the country came to Indianapolis to see for themselves. Jesse Owens, Langston Hughes, George Washington Carver. Meredith Nicholson, one of the leading authors of Indiana's golden age of literature, visited the school and saluted it for representing hope for American democracy. B.O. Davis Sr., the first African American to become a U.S. general, strode onto the Attucks Auditorium stage one afternoon, and life changed for a poor kid from the East Side.
I don't recall what he said, but I was fascinated with his appearance, his demeanor, and I just sort of said, that is what I want to do. So that is where the seed was planted.
Overton would become the second black general in Indiana history. Harry Brooks, Attucks class of 1947, was the first.
Attucks was the foundation. I never could have advanced as I did without that foundation.
By the time the future generals were leaving Attucks, other graduates had already left their mark. Charles DeBow took to the skies as one of the first 5 Tuskegee Airmen, the first black military aviators. Army War College studies less than 20 years earlier had proclaimed African Americans cowardly and incapable of performing the most remedial of tasks. But here was an Attucks grad flying combat missions over Germany and inspiring black soldiers nationwide with an essay in a popular magazine.
Around me, stretching away to the horizon, the red clay of Alabama, dotted with the corn and cotton fields where the Negroes are working, the same fields where their ancestors worked as slaves. I feel a catch in my throat. My people. Remember, it was called the Tuskegee Experiment because they expected it to fail.
Other Tuskegee Airmen from Attucks followed. Graham Martin, who graduated the year after DeBow, became one of the Golden 13, the first 13 commissioned black naval officers. The military was segregated then, but soon Attucks grad John Lee would become the first black officer in the integrated Navy. Josephine Kirk graduated from Attucks in 1940 at age 16, and she and classmate Dorothy Alexander became the first African-American women to be accepted into the Indiana University School of Medicine. At 24, Kirk was named Chief of Psychology at the nationally renowned Danvers, Massachusetts State Insane Asylum. She, too, gives full credit to Crispus Attucks.
Those teachers were interested in seeing that we became something. They were interested in us doing well.
For so many Attucks students, it was an Attucks teacher, not a college professor or colleague or even a family member, who changed their life.
I'd like to show you a couple pictures here.
Mr. Brown, boy, Mr. Brown was so free in what he does. You fall in love with him right away. He had so much love in his heart, you know, and I think perhaps maybe that's what I was drawn to.
She had taken my paper to her senior class and had read it to the class. She said, now this is what I call good writing. And that really had an impact on me. It really did.
Things that you didn't think you had in you, these teachers got them out of you, and you became proud of what has happened. When you saw the end results, did I do that? Was I capable of doing that?
I think they tried to make us dream.
Not everyone took advantage. Comprehensive graduation percentages have not been kept, but anecdotal evidence points to a rate hovering around 50%. Poverty, specifically the need to quit school to support the family, was clearly a factor for those not finishing. So were the high standards.
You know, everybody didn't get that message. There was that Crispus Attucks. Some did and some didn't. And I would say that a very large number of them did not get it, and they did not succeed. And those teachers made us work. They did.
For those willing to do the work, new horizons opened. Thanks to a patchwork of small scholarships and teachers networking in their free time, parents who never finished high school watched their kids go off to college.
I could begin to see a change, and this change became great. They began to go to college, and the colored people just didn't send their children to college. And they became teachers, lawyers, doctors, dentists, architects. And I've seen a tremendous change in the attitude of the colored people here in the city of Indianapolis.
Yet, even with Attucks' achievements, African Americans' push for desegregation had persisted. If the desire had been backburnered during the dark days of the Depression, World War II kicked it back to the front. In the euphoria of victory for global democracy,
it's official. It's all over. It's total victory.
Indianapolis and its 19th century racial mores didn't sit well when black soldiers returned home.
18, 19 years old, just gotten out of Attucks. They go to war. They put their feet on Omaha Beach. They go to the South Pacific and they see real action. And they come back here and they are once again second-class citizens.
I've interviewed several of these guys. They came back and I've never heard of one say otherwise. I was determined when I came home that I was not gonna take the shit I took, and one of them used that word, before I left to fight for my country in World War II.
And so they come back and they want something. They want whatever the community has to offer. They feel like they should get it. So they come back, and so you get a push.
In education, a pair of Attucks alumni helped lead the charge. Returned soldier Willard Ransom and Jesse Keyes Jacobs took on key roles in the desegregation fight, teaming with William T. Ray, Starling James, and powerful attorney Henry J. Richardson. A disaster kindled more outrage. When a fire destroyed a black elementary school, the principals at 3 neighboring white schools offered to take in the students. Instead, claiming it had nothing to do with race, the school board chose to bus the students to a condemned building 10 miles away, dismaying, seemingly for the first time, many white leaders as well.
So you're the average newspaper reader in Indianapolis, and you're saying, wait a minute, there are these schools that will absorb these kids at very little or perhaps not even any cost at all. And meanwhile, we're going to absorb the cost of transportation, the cost of rehab for this abandoned building, and the construction of 10 additional classrooms just to maintain a structure that you say is not race-based? You know, it's not race-based. So, well, what is it?
Elsewhere, integration was making inroads. In 1946, Gary leaders headed off a fight by proactively integrating schools. In 1948, after 21 years, Butler University rescinded its annual limit of 10 incoming African Americans. The year before, at Indiana University, Bill Garrett, who would later coach at Attucks, integrated the basketball team. By this point, Indianapolis reportedly was the only major northern city with a segregated school system. But when prominent white politicians such as William Fortune joined Jewish and women's groups in pushing for change, and when even staunch Republican Eugene Pulliam, publisher of the conservative Indianapolis Star, joined the cause, the future was clear. On March 8, 1949, Governor Henry Schricker made it law. For the first time in state history, race could play no role in where a student could attend public school. Only one problem. The law that promised a sea change, a death blow to segregation, Willard Ransom proclaimed, made ripples like a pebble.
It wasn't like, okay, this bill passed, and next school year in 1950, you have all the black kids going to other schools, and no, it didn't happen like that at all.
The law, 1949 law, should have ended discrimination. The execution of the law and the tolerance of that execution delayed integration, true integration, for at least 18 more years.
It would take a new set of ambassadors to take the story of Crispus Attucks, and with it the African American plight in Indianapolis in general, into the open.
Slave owner out of Virginia. The husband of the woman got sick, and they must have had some downturn in whatever they were doing. He died. The woman gets on her horse and comes out of Virginia with my father's grandfather, Robertson. He wasn't a Robertson, she was a Robertson. So the name came from the slave owner. You think a slave could name himself Robertson?
But they can't beat us. Hidey, 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 hi. Cab Calloway, I got that. Hidey, 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 ho. Old Skip Bop beat 'em. That's the crazy song.
Team that shattered records, advanced the sport, raised hopes, built bridges, and made national history.
We haven't seen anything like it since.
Its first big victory was winning the right to simply compete. The desire among Indianapolis's powers that be for Attucks to participate in the state's athletic pastime was plain from its conception. It had no gym. Nor would the Tigers be allowed to compete anyway, not with the state's public schools. In a monument to circular reasoning, Arthur Trester, the so-called czar of the Indiana High School Athletic Association, a man whose name would come to symbolize sportsmanship with the annual Trester Award,
The Trester Award presented by Mr. Cabby O'Neill,
denied Attucks' request for full membership and said it couldn't compete in the state tournament. Attucks wasn't a public school, the IHSAA declared, because it had no white students.
When I read that the first time, I kept thinking to myself, what? How? What? I don't get it. And then when I factor in that the highest award that you can get as a high school player is the Trester Award, I don't know.
So the Tigers hit the road to Gary, Evansville, St. Louis, Chicago, anywhere to find another all-black team. Trips were in cars, not buses, with no stops for food, and with relief coming at the side of the road.
We stayed in YMCAs, we stayed in flop houses that were filled with roaches and chinches and all that kind of foolishness. Sometimes we slept in gyms.
Home games left something to be desired as well. The few that Attucks hosted were contested on the school's auditorium stage, half the length of a regulation court, and with a 3.5-foot ledge marking out of bounds.
It's hard to believe every time I look at that stage and think about that. I just can't believe it.
The Depression loosened things a little as small-town schools seeking bigger crowds successfully petitioned the IHSAA to host this Attucks Novelty Act.
The people would come out in droves. It was almost as if they were going out to see the Globetrotters, for instance.
Yet still, the Tigers wanted for opponents and were locked out of the state tournament. A drumbeat began. A bill that would have abolished the IHSAA's discriminatory policy failed, but raised awareness. The Indianapolis Recorder went full throat. The Indianapolis Star chimed in. And in 1942, 15 years after Attucks opened, with the adjustment of a single sentence, the Tigers were in. Another Attucks victory came in short order. A bus departed Tennessee with a 4-year-old boy who would change a sport.
God created basketball when he created the Big O.
Maisel Robertson set out for Indianapolis with her 3 young boys, Bailey Jr., Henry, and Oscar, following her husband, Bailey Sr., who had moved to the city to find work. He didn't know they were coming.
They stopped everywhere. Horse Cave, Kentucky. They stopped in Bowling Green, Louisville, you name it. Every little city along, which was 31W. And reading those Burma Shave little things on the road, that's what kept you busy.
Get a little shoebox of chicken. I guess you heard that haven't you? That shoebox of chicken, and that's what you ate.
We got off down at the old Claypool Hotel, which is where the bus station was at that time. Since there was no one there waiting on us, we waited around. Then we decided that we might as well walk on up to my aunt Inez's house. Then we went straight up Senate Avenue, dragging and carrying suitcases. We found Dad and my aunt. We stayed there roughly about a year, and then we moved to Colton Street.
Colton Street, on the far end of the West Side Bottoms neighborhood. While the adjacent Lockfield Gardens had created a relative nirvana for many black families, most of the surrounding area had been left behind, and Colton Street was among the worst.
And that's where you found those galvanized metal houses nailed to 2x4s, dirt floors, no inside plumbing.
There were outhouses, and we had one. We had one up to 1953, I think. Quite a few of the people in the neighborhood had outhouses.
You know, it was a shotgun house. You see all the way through it from the front. Had a potbelly stove in the front and a kitchen stove, and that was it. You get up in the morning and start a fire. And in the winter times, just put on 3 or 4 blankets and jumped into bed.
The children of Colton Street called it by another name, Kincaid's Hole.
There was a movie house called the Lido Theater, and they showed a lot of Westerns. And this one Western had Sunset Carson in it. Sunset Carson was a cowboy, slow talking on a white horse, and he went into the saloon called Kincaid.
Welcome to Kincaid's Hole. Thanks, Kohler.
And gets into an argument, and they had a deal there with the Kincaid. If 2 men got into a fight, open up his hole in the floor, put them down in there, and that was Kincaid's Hole. That's what we call our street.
They'd pop you in the mouth. You know, they were all fighters, you know, and in fact, it was really popular then. It was a lot of guys good with these.
If you can make it in Kincaid Hole, buddy, you can make it anywhere, okay?
The Robertsons' father worked as a meat skinner, their mother as a maid for a white family on the north side, taking her meals on the back porch. Life for the boys was simple. Other than school, they rarely ventured beyond the neighborhood. Summers found them back on the bus to Tennessee and their grandparents' farm.
In rows of corn that's so far you can't even see the end of them.
Basketball began in a dirt lot down Colton, where the bigger kids nailed up a hoop and gave the young Robertsons a beating.
Couldn't do anything with those guys at that time. I was didn't have the strength or the quickness. I didn't know what I was doing half the time.
And then one day, Oscar followed his eldest brother Bailey over to the south end of Lockfield Gardens, and the legend began.
When I first met Oscar, he was about 9, I was about 17. Fuzzy said, we're gonna have 3-on-3. He said, you got Palmer. I said, who's Palmer? He said, he's right there, Palmer. That was Oscar.
Growing up in the South, you always have 3 names. And usually they call you by your first 2 names. And they called me Oscar Palmer. They didn't say Oscar. They said Oscar Palmer.
He wore me out. He wore me out. I said, I ain't got Palmer no more.
The Dust Bowl. From inauspicious beginnings, 2 goals in the dirt of a grade school playground at the south end of Lockfield Gardens had arisen one of the top basketball proving grounds in the Midwest. Soon paved over with asphalt, it had kept its moniker, and it was here, while Oscar Robertson and his game grew, that the Attucks dynasty was born.
The basketball court was just outside the window of one of the classes, and I used to look out, and the older guys out there playing. I had a vision, someday maybe I can bounce the ball, do different things. That picture was in my mind. I would go to bed at night thinking about how I could see myself doing it. Bam, bam.
People would come from all over. Guys from college would come by, come back to school and play, and when they played like they played in college.
There were locals, Willie J. and Kenny Washington, and guys known as Electro, Scar Jackson, and Red Post. There were high-profile visitors like Jumpin' Johnny Wilson and college All-Americans Bill Garrett and Don Schlunt. There was Oscar's brother Bailey, who would set scoring records at Indiana Central that still stood 60 years later, and the whirling dervish known as Hallie Bryant.
Boom, get in there and float.
Who would go on to star at Indiana University and jet set with the Globetrotters. There was the quiet giant, Willie Gardner, one of the greatest players the greater basketball world never saw. A 2-time Trotters MVP.
Quickly as Willie Gardner drives to score on a close-up shot.
Whose surefire NBA career was ended by a heart ailment before his first regular season game.
He did things that Dr. J tried to do in high school. Between the legs, dribble down the court, just amazing, amazing.
And off to the side was a sharp-dressed man in his mid-30s, watching and waiting.
And he came up and he said, Hallie, I want you to play for me someday. I'm in 4th grade now. That's all he needed to say. That dream, he said, you can play for me someday. Whew. Big dream.
Ray Crow, a Franklin native and multi-sport star at Indiana Central. He took over the Attucks program in 1950 and instantly became the Pied Piper for up-and-coming black talent.
There must have been, and I'm not exaggerating, there must have been 500 kids who came out for basketball. Probably 20% of them weren't even enrolled in school.
He was a father figure to most of them because a lot of them didn't have fathers in them. He was the only father figure that they knew. They respected him and they loved him.
Attucks' previous coach had preached a passive style, emphasizing sportsmanship over all else. Crow kept the sportsmanship and stepped on the gas. With assistant Al Spurlock at his side, Crow would retire as Attucks coach 7 years later with a record of 179-20. To this day, the greatest 7-year stretch by any team in state history. His rookie season provided an apt introduction.
The Flying Tigers of Crispus Attucks, coached by the inimitable Ray Crow.
Led by Bryant.
Hallie with a 2-handed shot.
Beautiful.
and Gardner.
Up and in by Willie Gardner.
Attucks won its first 6 games, lost its 7th, and then won 12 straight. The school's first sectional title sent the black community into a lather. The regional championship on a last-second shot by Oscar's big brother Bailey.
He took that famous flip shot, and it went in.
Sent sports writers to new heights of hyperbole. There had been more than 24,500 games in the history of the state tournament to that point, and according to the only comprehensive list of scores, none had come within 10 points of the 161 that Attucks and Anderson combined for that night. The state was put on notice. These Tigers were different kinds of cats.
It was another dimension. It was a forward peek at what the game would evolve to.
The Tigers would lose in the Final Four, but they proved no fluke. They went 43-6 the next 2 seasons, with Crow and his players capturing national headlines for breaking new ground as an all-black team. Yet both years they were upset in the state tournament. Re-enter Oscar Robertson, who had ventured down to Tennessee one summer a boy, and return a man.
It was a little different animal then.
And he come back, he shot up, plus that talent shot up with him. And he was off the charts.
And the elder guys wanted to teach me a lesson, but they didn't get to teach.
In Robertson's 3 years on varsity, the Tigers went 85-6. All but one of those losses came during his sophomore year, which ended in a bitter defeat to the team of destiny, small-town Milan, whose ultimate championship would be dramatized in the movie Hoosiers.
We were fortunate to play them when he was a sophomore. I'll say that.
Then they won the championship, so they were crowned the champs.
The next season, 1955, the real teaching began. The Tigers won by margins other teams couldn't total. A school built without a gym played regular season games at Butler Fieldhouse in front of 11,000 plus. A poor kid from Colton Street became easily the best player in the state and kept getting better.
Oscar Robertson from the corner. Perfect. Robertson is on.
And his support team, Willie Merriweather, Bill Hampton, Bill Scott, Shedrick Mitchell, and Bill Brown, was without a weak link. The fast break shredded. Defense swarmed. Kids dreamed.
When all that happened, there was this explosion of kids playing basketball everywhere.
Cheerleaders rocked.
So fabulous. The Attucks cheerleaders were dancing. They had everybody up. You knew the wonderful, nobody's gonna beat us.
Opponents sulked. Politicians took advantage. And the crazy song, penned by graduate Edwina Bell a decade earlier, played on.
And did they stand and was proud? Because they had it right here. Mr. Green, it's no good unless it's right here.
And never, not that season or any other in Attucks' reign, not in Indianapolis, not on the road, not amid threats and racist slurs from fans.
Cars would stop and they'd roll down the window and say, "Beat those GD niggers, you get those niggers." And it shocked the heck out of us.
Never once did the Attucks Tigers get in an altercation. They knew the stakes, and if they didn't, Principal Russell Lane warned them before each game.
People are watching you, and they'll judge what you do. They will judge the race by what you do.
And I solemnly was saying, "Lord, please don't let anybody get hurt. If our team kicks some booty and the people get a little upset with us, let's get out of town quick."
Frankly, I don't know how they did it. I really don't. If they would have lashed out, if there would have been some type of fight or something on the floor, all of the racists would have said, "I told you so. I told you so. See, they can't handle it." How much self-discipline they had to have more so than all the other teams that they played against. That's the significance of Crispus Attucks, and that's why it was such a moving point as far as segregation was concerned.
People were beginning to see that we were people and not just black people that had some kind of infirmity or what have you.
Black leaders saw something too, a new agent for change.
Oh, absolutely, it was political. They were desperate to try to find things. They tried to do court appeals. They tried to get legislative change made. They tried to act better. They tried to, go to school and get education. None of it worked. But all of a sudden they see that the Indianapolis community is following the basketball team. They're following them. They're all of a sudden, they're an Indianapolis Star, and it's not an afterthought. This is a team that's looked like it's going to compete for the state championship in a city that had never won a state championship. And I think the recorder, the Indianapolis recorder, saw this and said, whoa, this group of kids is representing the city.
All of a sudden, we became Indianapolis Attucks. Instead of Crispus Attucks High School, we became Indianapolis Attucks.
Oh, tremendously important. Tremendously important. The biggest thing that happened to us,
Some in the white community also regarded Attucks as a bridge builder. Starting in 1954, the school superintendent took a brave leap, enlisting one cheerleader from each of the other city schools to join the Tiger Squad during their tournament runs. The result received national billing and left a lasting impact on a proud Shortridge grad.
Really neat. It's really neat. Not everybody gets a chance to do that. To be part of something that was so significant, and yet as a 16-year-old, you just didn't realize it. And one of the girl cheerleaders from Attucks said, you white guys aren't so bad after all.
The 1955 state tournament gave them something to cheer about. Attucks defeated its sectional opponents by an average of 27 points, its regional foes by an average of 39. The dream game, number 2 Attucks versus number 1 Muncie Central, lived up to its billing, as did Robertson, who stole a last-second pass to seal a 1-point victory.
There's Robertson, he got it.
The week of the finals whipped up a basketball frenzy previously unseen in Indianapolis. Not only could Attucks become its first state champion, it was discovered that no all-black basketball team had ever won an open state tournament anywhere in the nation. Chicago DuSable had come closest, losing in the Illinois state finals the year before. And now in Indiana, there were 2 black teams, Attucks and Gary Roosevelt, in the Final Four. Hundreds of schools around Indiana that a decade or 2 earlier wouldn't have let Attucks and Roosevelt in their gyms could now only take their turn on the bench and watch.
In 55, 2 black teams.
That was miraculous. So that was a commentary all its own.
Sure enough, Attucks and Roosevelt advanced to the final. And if ever a performance met the moment, this was it.
There's Oscar Robertson. Beautiful shot. Oscar is on. 2-0. Attucks. There goes Mitchell. Brown firing. Good. Robertson going under. It's in there. Brown got it to Mitchell. In there. Attucks has been tremendous in this first half.
Roosevelt boasted Mr. Basketball Wilson Eisen and future NBA champion Dick Barnett and was totally outclassed. The outcome was decided by halftime. The only question was whether the Tigers would reach 100 points. Led by Robertson's record 30.
Robertson, he'll fire from the corner. Could be it is. That's 30 points for him.
They nearly did. Their final tally of 97 points was 29 more than the most scored by the 44 previous state champions.
That was like the NBA had come to high school basketball.
Only 8 seconds to go out of. They're not going to get there. 6 seconds. There's Ford firing. And it's all over. Indianapolis wins their first state basketball championship.
Typewriters clattered coast to coast, for Attucks' victory didn't happen in a vacuum. That very same night, The University of San Francisco, featuring Bill Russell and Casey Jones, won the NCAA crown, and black newspapers across the country, citing both feats, began hailing 1955 as the biggest year to date in African American sports. Something to smile about in a year of such racial strife.
The Attucks story has immense consequences because it comes right in the heart of the Civil Rights Revolution. Right at the time of Brown versus Board of Education, Americans have their antennae, their ears cocked to hear stories of race and to try to sort them out and understand them. It happened at just the right time. It was almost ordained.
Even then, we sensed it was a time for the ages.
You know, we know the great story of Milan, tiny Milan, never goes away and gets inflated and inflated. But I think we're moving toward a time where the Attucks story may hide the Milan story, because I think the Attucks story is more interesting, more important, more enduring.
Yet back home in Indiana, the glow of breakthrough would soon gather a lasting shadow. The Circle City feted the Tigers as not simply champs, but racial ambassadors, with politicians and businessmen stepping all over each other to bestow platitudes. Yet it later was revealed that some of those very same people, behind closed doors, had motives that were less than inclusive.
We were about to win that championship. The week before, they called me down to school. I was superintendent with Dr. Shiver. They had the fire chief down there and the police chief and representatives from the businessmen downtown sitting around the table. And they called me in. So they said to me, Mr. Layden says, look like your team's going to win the championship next Saturday night. The Merchants downtown are frightened that after you win that championship, the colored people will come downtown and tear up the downtown. Break out the windows, knock out the street lights and all that. I said, I don't believe we'll do one thing.
Principal Russell Lane was informed that should Attucks win the championship, its parade could include a quick lap around Monument Circle, for years the traditional celebration spot for city teams. But from there, even with the city's biggest ever athletic feat to celebrate, Attucks would have to move off to the west side of town, to a park deep in the black neighborhood.
Oh, you're black, you're going to tear this place up. Are you going to? Well, why would we tear it up? Now, we go downtown to shop. They take your money. You know, isn't that something? They work and wash dishes, clean up for them and whatnot, all garbage out. But they won't let you do that. Innocent young men and women. They went to school, went to class, they went to church. They loved their families. They just happened to be very good basketball players. It's unforgivable.
The Attucks Flying Tigers would go on to win the state title again in 1956, becoming the first undefeated champ. In 1957, they would reach the title game without the graduated Oscar Robertson. And in 1959, they would win it all again under new coach Bill Garrett. But for so many in Indianapolis's black community, 1955 is the year that resonates, because it proved two things.
It proved the world was not going to end if blacks were the superior in anything. It proved that.
It also proved there was so much further to go.
It wouldn't surprise me if we were going to have a celebration next week that somebody would suggest the very same thing. If they were going to have fire trucks coming and so on, that somebody would try to develop a route where African Americans would not be able to cause much harm.
This is Indianapolis, crossroads of America, hub of the state. Most of us think our city is a mighty good place to live. This too is Indianapolis, the part often overlooked, neglected, left to rot. These are our slums.
In the 1950s, even as the Crispus Attucks basketball team was bringing people together, the heart of the black community was coming apart. Outside of Lockfield Gardens, much of the near west side still wallowed in extreme poverty, as African Americans continued to pour into the city, and restrictive housing covenants, whites-only clauses weren't removed from the real estate board bylaws until the mid-60s, continued to pen them in. A series of housing studies exposed the problem, but where African Americans saw a need to improve conditions, city government saw an opportunity for a different kind of renewal, an opportunity that would also meet a desire by IUPUI to expand its medical campus.
Having used up its available land, it needed room to grow, but the area was hemmed in by White River on the west, Fall Creek on the north, and slums on the other two sides. The answer? Redevelopment.
The result, the massive displacement of Indianapolis's near west side black community. More than 10,000 people were forced out of their homes, most of which were destroyed. Some families received money, though in many cases not enough to find comparable housing elsewhere. Others simply saw their homes condemned or claimed by eminent domain. Unlike with federal relocation rules, the city didn't take responsibility for helping people find new homes, instead vowing to give it every consideration. The Flannerholm self-building project helped, but not nearly enough. Great pillars of the black community, such as Lockfield Gardens and Indiana Avenue, started a steep descent, exacerbated when Interstate 65 was rerouted downtown beginning in the 1960s.
I knew of several families that were evicted and had no means. I mean, the little money that they gave them, and most of them didn't even own their properties down there. The property owners took the money and, they just had, fend for themselves.
A lot of them had to go into nursing homes and senior citizen apartments. It was rough.
The hardest thing I saw in researching this project was a picture. And the picture actually is on the cover of my book. And it's a 2-story outhouse. And I was like, in Indianapolis, a stone's throw from the Capitol, is people using a 2-story outhouse. It was the one time I was at the archive where I just had to go take a walk because I just couldn't fathom how that would be allowed and how that would be tolerated. And clearly, it was part of the motivation for the urban renewal. But without looking at the conditions that brought that into being, that reality into being, and the complicity that the city fathers had in creating that system or creating that reality, it was just blind. They were just blind to it. Instead, they said, let's remove it and wish them the best of luck.
They used to call it urban renewal is Negro removal.
We would be naive not to look at the financial incentive to destroy a neighborhood and not provide public housing or some kind of remedy or some kind of assistance for them to move somewhere else in the community. It's predatory.
The dilemma for me is always that, now, I believe the state government and sometimes the university itself simply don't have the courage to face up to that heritage. So we don't have that discussion, and it becomes more complicated because we don't have the honest and sober discussion out in public and understand that we were in fact complicitous. We did fuel urban renewal. We actively contributed to it and encouraged it.
Educational inequity persisted as well. By 1953, just 4 years after the School Desegregation Act, city leaders and newspapers were trumpeting victory, even touting Indy as an example for southern cities to follow. They pointed out that 2/3 of Indianapolis students now went to integrated schools, which included all but one of the city's public high schools, Attucks. But a closer look told a different story. In 4 of 8 high schools, less than 6% of students were black, while Attucks wouldn't see a white student for a decade and a half. Black students who lived closer to Shortridge and Washington were assigned to Attucks. White students who lived by Attucks were sent elsewhere. In 1957, Thomas Howe High School had 12 black students. Broad Ripple had 1.
That kid was sick. It was the segregated school again, you know?
And while city officials lauded the transition as pain-free, they didn't look very hard.
Like I was entering an alien land. Like I had been abandoned in some faraway place and had no possibility of rescue. That's how I felt.
Janet Cheatham Bell grew up on the south side of Indianapolis, dreaming of following her older brother to Attucks. Instead, her parents sent her to Manual, starting in 1950. With few exceptions, she said, the students ignored her.
I can remember a few of them wanting to touch my skin just to see if it felt like theirs.
The bigger problem was that teachers ignored her too, which she later chronicled in an arresting autobiography. Despite good grades in middle school, at Manual, Bell was initially placed into a class for the mentally handicapped. Despite her yearnings to attend college, her guidance counselor pushed her toward a home economics track so she could become a maid.
So no, they didn't expect anything from us, except they had to take us and, just hurry up and get out of here. So I felt no affection, no high school spirit, none of that, none of it.
I can't remember any blatant experiences of racism that I experienced at Shortridge. It was just the environment itself. It was the feeling you got. You didn't have to be called a nigger to feel you weren't wanted. Let me put it like that, to feel you weren't wanted.
At Attucks, with its main feeder neighborhood decimated, attendance dropped as black students left and no whites replaced them. Yet still it churned out remarkable graduates. Students who won 4 Genius Scholarships, became the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy, became an Olympian, a world champion, and an opera star. Students who changed the city's complexion, becoming its first black city prosecutor, first black fire chief, first black police chief, and first black congresswoman. Janet Floyd, who became a model, then a newswoman and an author and playwright, and whose platform as a humanitarian elevated when she married Secretary of Defense William Cohen.
Even more, I want to thank his wife, Janet, who more than any other American citizen has tirelessly traveled this world to show the support we all feel for our troops. Thank you, Janet Cohen. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And all the while, as city leaders clapped backs about desegregation, African Americans continued to push for true reform. Fittingly, the biggest push came from a longtime Crispus Attucks teacher. Andrew Ramsey started teaching languages at Attucks in 1935, and in the 1940s began a nearly 3-decade run as columnist for the Indianapolis Recorder. His ire hit both sides of the racial aisle. Whites for clinging to Indy's segregationist roots, blacks for not fighting back harder.
And he was one of the few public school teachers who was really active in the civil rights movement.
Built in the hands-on mold of Matthias Nolcox, Ramsey championed civil rights, tackling causes of all nature and joining sit-ins during his lunch hour at restaurants that refused to serve blacks. True to form, he successfully appealed to the Indiana Civil Rights Commission to force a transfer out of Attucks and into mostly white Howe High School, claiming that students there were being discriminated against by not being exposed to African Americans.
And he would receive these late night calls about, you're a communist, we're gonna kill you, we're gonna come out there and burn your house down, but he didn't care. Mr. Ramsey didn't care. He was one of the most heroic men I've known in life. He was fantastic.
He was brave. There are a lot of people who excel, but there's so few of us who are brave.
People would say, oh, you're going too fast. He said, well, how fast am I going? You know, we can't wait.
It was Ramsey who found the key to change. Frustrated by the school board's tenacity at fending off integration, he determined the solution would have to come from outside. Helped by Indianapolis's new Urban League, the NAACP, and a team of top black attorneys, Ramsey counseled an IPS family to take his complaint of unfair treatment not to the school board or state authorities, as was the usual practice, but rather to the Justice Department of the United States. It was this letter, by one unhappy parent, that brought down the system. In 1968, as racial and political tension roiled the country,
I have some very sad news for all of you. Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
the Justice Department sued Indianapolis Public Schools. 3 years later, in a monumental ruling by federal judge S. Hugh Dillon, all of IPS's warts were revealed. Of 350 school district boundary changes since 1954, more than 90% were found to have promoted segregation. Additions had been built to old, overcrowded black schools rather than transferring students to white schools with vacant classrooms. Sites for new schools had been chosen to minimize black enrollment. In short, IPS was guilty of de jure segregation, and Dillon's rebuke couldn't have been more plain.
He was a man of courage. He took tremendous heat, as we all know, tremendous criticism.
It was a ringing indictment of a system that had perpetuated for far too long and illegally.
What followed was mostly one-way busing, black students out to the suburbs, and a litany of motions and appeals nearly impossible to follow and still causing controversy when the plan was finally phased out in 2016. One darkly ironic byproduct was all too clear. Crispus Attucks, whose achievements had done so much to expose the need for change, went into sharp decline. Talks of closing or moving the school fizzled, but enrollment, now integrated, plummeted, and many of Attucks' top teachers retired or were sent elsewhere.
Oh, that was a large brain drain, very large.
That's our greatness. Just like when you took the avenue from us, you ripped the heart out of our chest. That how can we live?
As if on cue, Attucks' impact began to flower across the nation. In 1971, the same year as Judge Dillon's ruling, Oscar Robertson led his team to an NBA championship.
The Milwaukee Bucks are champions of the world! Oh, this is great, Judge. Finally got it.
In 1972, Harry Brooks became General Harry Brooks, the first black general in Indiana history. His impact was felt in many ways. By the 10,000 men he helped get a high school education, by his service as the Army's Director of Race Relations, and by the young black officers he mentored along the way.
Harry was the guy who made the Army look at itself in the mirror and make them look in the mirror and say, is this the Army we want to be? Is this the Army of the American people? And you can put yourself at risk, and Harry put himself at risk at that, but he didn't care. He was there to do the job, and he did the job. He was the conscience of the Army.
A young man came up to me and said, sir, you don't know what your encouragement did for me. He said, I have my PhD. And I wasn't thinking about going to school until you made me. And I got a kick out of that.
That meant a lot to you.
It meant a lot to me.
In 1973, jazz great David Baker was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. In 1974, Paul Parks became the first black Secretary of Education for the state of Massachusetts. In 1975, Jerry Williams became Vice President at a $400 million a year auto supply company. 13 years later, he became the first African American to grace the cover of Fortune magazine.
What I found out that Crispus Attucks helped me do was to dream, to dare, and to do. And that's exactly what it was. And that's what I tried to do. I dreamed, I dared to try, and I was able to do it.
What people can learn from Crispus Attucks High School is that high school kids have the power and the ability to change a community. And nowadays we see a lot more kids going out and protesting things, and we saw that in the 60s as well. But what we didn't see is kids going to school, prospering through their school, and creating change afterwards. That we don't see. And we see that in Attucks. We see it in Attucks because those graduates did things afterwards. It's a long game. I'll grant you that. It's a long game, and it takes assiduous study, but they were committed to the long game. The people in Indianapolis were patient, man. Maybe sometimes too patient. Yeah, maybe sometimes too patient, but they were patient. They played the long game, and Crispus Attucks was a central part of that long game. They were educating their kids for the next generation, and I think it's because they knew it had been better and it could be better again.
In that high school lived hope. And I think in order for people to be successful, they have to have hope. And I think had Attucks not been as successful as it was, people would have lost a lot of hope and things would have been a lot different.
In 1986, after years of decline, the school that opened so many doors was closed. A heated protest brought back graduates from around the country for naught. Attucks would reopen as a junior high and then a middle school, and in 2006 it became a medical magnet serving grades 6 through 12. But at the time, and still in the eyes of many, 1986 was the end.
It was like a death, okay? Like a death of a family member. That's something that you love very much, and then it's gone.
It was sort of a closing down of some people's dreams and some people's hopes about what possibilities there were for the future of a race of people.
In the 3 decades since, the hurt has mostly healed, replaced by wistful memories, gratefulness, and pride. But questions about the Crispus Attucks experience linger. At the end of his biography, former basketball coach Ray Crow wrote of the irony of African Americans protesting the closing of a school they had protested the opening of 60 years earlier. While noting his own disappointment in the closure, he wondered whether in the bigger picture Attucks was a sick social experiment best ended. Some of Attucks' other towering figures, including Andrew Ramsey and original Tuskegee Airman Charles DeBow, were in favor of raising the school as early as the late 60s because of the segregation it stood for. Ramsey opined that the Attucks nostalgia so common among graduates was akin to freed slaves yearning for the security of chattel slavery. Others who are staunch Attucks fans wonder if a Crispus Attucks, as it used to be, would be as effective in today's world.
I find that it's difficult to get the attention or the interest of some of the people that I talk to today. I went over to Dunbar High School several years ago to talk to the students about what a military career could do for them. I couldn't get their interest. I could not compete with Michael Jordan because so many of these kids have their role models etched out of the entertainment world, the sports world, or whatever. I spoke to one group, and one of the students asked me, well, how much money do you make? So I told him how much money I made as a vice president at Amtrak. He said, oh, I can make that much money in a week selling drugs. So it was difficult to see where Crispus Attucks could help that young man. We lost him somewhere early on. Maybe I would have been lost somewhere early on had it not been for Rayfield Anderson or a Charles DeBow or a General Davis. Maybe I would have been lost.
Attucks' vast alumni association has vowed to do whatever it takes to keep the building standing. They say it's critical as a model of what can be accomplished.
An example for the kids. You can do this too. This kid, Harry Brooks, was sitting in that chair didn't know any more than you did, yet he was able to accomplish what he did. You can do it too. So the biggest thing that I can give to kids coming along is the example. They can do it.
It's so important that children in Indianapolis, especially, know about some of these figures who helped build Attucks and who graduated from Attucks.
New principal Lauren Franklin's parents and grandparents attended Attucks, joining a couple dozen more relatives on the walls.
25 to 30, that sound right?
That sounds about right.
The latest Franklin at the school promises to continue the fight.
There was a spirit of excellence. There was a teaching that you have to be better. And I think now we lack that. There's a casualness, there is a lack of respect for education in our society. And that's one of the things that I want to bring back. It's very personal for me.
If we could just get the spirit of the students who are coming to this school now to be like the alumni who were here, miracles would happen.
Of one thing, there is no question. The lessons and impact of Crispus Attucks High School, a school built on bigotry, make a nation proud. In the military, with graduates who broke barriers and a path.
If Harry Brooks had failed as a general, there were a whole lot of people who would silently say to themselves, you see, they can't do it. So you needed a Harry Brooks, you needed the Buffalo Soldiers, you needed the Tuskegee Airmen, you needed the Navy Golden 13 to prove to the country that we could do anything you can do. Just give us the education and give us the opportunity.
In civil rights, including a graduate who came from Lockfield Garden to Capitol Hill to honor the mother of the movement.
For her, I think it was the apex of her career. It was a crown jewel of sorts of her political career, but it was spanning for over 30 years.
In education, from the courageous first principal and the first teacher whose name now adorns IPS headquarters, to countless who followed, who challenged and inspired.
It's part of my spirit. It's part of my soul. I think that's my responsibility.
In the arts,
freedom. Freedom of choice. Freedom to be who I am, to create, to be.
And in sports.
Thank heavens there was an Attucks and an Oscar Robertson and a Ray Crow and all the players that played for them, because it was very significant and it did help. That is what Crispus Attucks gave to not just the state but the nation.
In thousands of other graduates and descendants of graduates determined to resurrect greatness and to pay it forward. Their spirit.
Our spirit lives on, and it does. It'll never die, Ted Green.
There's something that draws you back to Crispus Attucks High School.
Maya Angelou's has a poem that says, "Still I rise, we rise."
I still rise. We still rise. We've kept our spirit, we've kept our integrity.
That'll be with me until I check out of this life.
Through it all, he came through on top. Through it all.
To see what has happened after Crispus Attucks, it's amazing.
It's been about 60 years in coming, Andrew.
Yeah, absolutely right. Your grand marshals this year, the 1955 Crispus Attucks High School basketball state champions, an honor long overdue.
You know, it's often been said, oh, black people have come a long way. No. I say it another way. It is white people who've come a long way.
This is unbelievable.
We're an amazing people. If we can convince and teach the students, we are an amazing people. Look what we've come through. Look what we can still do. Be amazed. Believe.
There were lessons learned from this, and we had to carry those lessons that were learned to the next level. Our job still goes on.
Attucks, the school that opened a city, was made possible through the generous support of the Ephraimson Family Fund, Lilly Endowment, C&O Financial Group, providing health and life insurance as well as retirement solutions. The Indianapolis Foundation, an affiliate of the Central Indiana Community Foundation. The Allen Whitehill Clues Charitable Foundation. Impact 100 Greater Indianapolis. The family of Samuel and Alexis Odell. Thomas Sharp. Donald Moffett. Additional funding was provided by the following.
So from now on, you're just talking to me. Just me, the good-looking guy, right here.
I thought this was a good.
Oh, well, I stand corrected.
To order a DVD or Blu-ray copy of Attucks, the school that opened a city, go to wfyi.org/Attucks or call 317-715-2009.
It was going to be the hardest story to tell. It was going to be the hardest story to find funding for. But it was, I won't mention the other ideas, but it was the best story to do. I have fears at times that the story is better than my ability to communicate it. On the other hand, you know, someone's going to try to do it. I guess I would be the producer, director, writer, and most importantly, voice talent. Only because we can't afford another voice talent, and I always know where to find me. I still consider myself a journalist more than a filmmaker. I got a master's degree in journalism. I spent my first 20 years in newspapers, mostly in sports. At the Cincinnati Enquirer, at the Miami Herald, and then most recently at the Indianapolis Star. In 2010, I don't know, maybe because I was in my 40s and I wanted to try something new, but also because John Wooden, icon John Wooden, was about to turn 100. And we thought, you know, what can we do to do something to celebrate him just a little differently? And I thought, well, let's try our hand at a little 5-minute video. How hard could it be? Well, 5 minutes, because I got so into it, because I do, turned into 35 minutes. Didn't know what to do with it. The paper didn't know what to do with it. The paper was kind of ticked, actually, because they're like, what's this guy been doing all this time? Well, so we cold called it up to WFYI. They liked it. It has been airing for the past 5 years on American public television. You have to research everything you can, and I think once you do that, you'll be passionate about it. I couldn't pick a project that I wasn't passionate about, because you spend so much time. There isn't a lot of money in this. You know, you have to commit, but once you have committed, and the people who are involved know you're committed, then you can sit in a room after laying down. Then you can sit in a room with people who can make this happen. And you know what? They're not looking to say no. These people really are looking to say yes. They want to support big, good projects. They just need to believe you. And they need to believe you can do it. So I read everything I could read, but I also just spent time in houses listening to people who actually live. Because this was going to be their story.
So all 4 of these people went to Attucks. And those are her parents. Right. Oh boy, 2 minutes. Okay.
Oh man, this is really, I'm just honored to be here.
The research is the fun part. Now I've got to take this mountain of research, and what I'm doing right now at home is trying to steer, a cogence, and what it's all about is what parts you let breathe and what parts you have to sort of cover over fast when you're going through a story this broad, and you find yourself wanting to let every part breathe. This film can't be all things to all people because it's just covering so much ground and so many topics. But if it can at least shine some light on the magic that happened inside these walls and how that affected lives and has left an impact truly around the country and did move the needle on race relations. But what drives the story is the pride, the heartfelt pride that you see. You see it in the eyes as much as you hear it in the words. And that's when you know. That's when you get a little nervous. You're like, man, am I man enough to do this story? That's when you know we're onto something here.
Mr. Green, I love you.
They are the faces of the past, speaking to a new generation. A team of educators from IUPUI, Butler University, and IPS worked for months on a curriculum guide to help students learn a wide range of subject matter based on the Attucks documentary.
The Crispus Attucks documentary curriculum guide is designed to develop inquiry, critical thinking, and connections to students' social identities. The guide is lodged in an approach that best can be described as the term history is inquiry, but underpinning it are the values of social justice, an ethic of care, equity in social and cultural relationships, and it's embedded in anti-racist work.
Crispus Attucks Medical Magnet School now serves students from the 6th through the 12th grades. Principal Lauren Franklin wanted all of them to see the documentary to understand that they attend a school of special historical significance.
This is a special place and this is hallowed ground.
So in 2 school assemblies, the students gathered to watch the stories of the people who were once in their places.
But it was a thunderous applause at the end. The students were talking about it. They asked when their parents could see the film. Was the film going to be released in theaters? Could they see it again? I went to several classrooms after they were released from the auditorium, and the students had such profound comments. It's almost as if the film gave them an instant pride in Crispus Attucks.
Lots of people that have made changes in this world came out of this school, and I didn't know that. This film makes me want to be more than just any old picture on the wall. It makes me want to have a story and have people come back to see my picture and say, oh, she did this, or she was the first this.
The way they were in the classrooms and stuff like that, that made me want to start doing a lot better and start to push myself and be better.
I think the film should be used kind of like as a reflection, to know that anything can be accomplished.
For exclusive videos, extended interviews, plus curriculum and discussion guides, visit WFYI.org/Attucks.